Hey everyone, you are listening to the Divergent Conversations podcast. We are two neurodivergent mental health professionals in a neurotypical world. I'm Patrick Casale.
And I'm Dr. Neff.
And during these episodes, we do talk about sensitive subjects, mental health, and there are some conversations that can certainly feel a bit overwhelming. So we do just want to use that disclosure and disclaimer before jumping in. And thanks for listening.
Well, hello, Patrick. We haven't recorded in a couple weeks. It's good to see you.
I really love when I say, like, Megan, you start us off because I can just tell how uncomfortable you are starting us off.
I did the social ligament thing though. I was like, "Hi, it's good to see you, Patrick."
It's good to see you too.
I, we are starting a new series today.
Yeah.
We're going to be talking about OCD for at least 4 weeks, maybe more.
Yep.
Yeah. How are you feeling about this series?
I'm feeling okay. I know I know you're feeling a bit nervous or overwhelmed by it. We've talked about this for a while. We want to do more collections. We want to do more series so that y'all can follow along from episode to episode instead of bouncing all over the place. And I think that's worked really well. Would I say I'm nervous about talking about OCD? Yeah, because I clinically just don't have the foundational strength that you do. So I'm going to let you guide and see where it goes.
Yeah. Yeah. It is interesting because I think it's, for me, OCD is both personal and then also clinically. Like, I know it's clinically so complex and I'm like, I want to get it right because there are a lot of misconceptions around OCD. I'm also excited. I know we're having a handful of guests on. I'm excited to learn more about OCD. Like, I know how to diagnose OCD. I know what OCD is, but I'm not an OCD specialist. Like, I don't specialize in working with OCD. I'm not ERP trained or some of the special modalities. So I'm also looking forward to learning from our guests as we have them on. Especially, I'm hearing more and more about kind of how to conceptualize OCD or OCD treatment from a neurodivergent-affirming lens. I'm excited to learn about that. But yeah, OCD is complex for me. I've had it since I was a kid, and I don't experience OCD in the same way I experience my autism or ADHD. For me personally, I don't put it in the same camp.
I was also diagnosed OCD when I
Wait,
was a
you
young,
were?
yeah,
I
yeah,
didn't
yeah.
know that.
As a younger adult, probably about 20 years old, I received that diagnosis.
And is that a diagnosis that fits? Or you're like, yes, or do you feel like that was a misdiagnosis?
Might complicate this conversation right now, but I go back and forth between OCD and OCPD a lot of the time.
Oh, well, I have a whole article on that. I actually love that topic. Maybe we should add an episode on OCD versus OCPD because that is actually, I get that question a lot, and I just created my Venn diagram on it a couple months ago. Um, I definitely have OCPD traits as well, and I have OCD. Yeah.
Yeah, it's so complicated and it's complex. I think, you mentioned misconceptions, and I think for those of you listening, I think what's the immediate thought when you think of OCD? My immediate mind goes to like checking the stove a million times before you leave the
Mhm.
house, or
Wait, you don't do that?
I don't do that now.
I do that.
That's not one of my traits that I experience. Or touching a doorknob X amount of times before you
Mhm.
can leave, or a light switch. I think that's what comes up for a lot of people when they immediately think of
Yeah,
OCD.
that really classic picture of compulsions. Yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely. And I think that's actually one of the reasons. So there's one research study that showed on average, it takes 12 years from symptom onset to get diagnosed. And I think what you're naming right now is one of the reasons people often don't get diagnosed with OCD. OCD has so many different flavors. It can be internal, it can be external. And if you're not doing the classic, it's kind of like the autism thing, right? If you're not a classical presenter, it can be missed. So if you're not doing the like hand washing or the checking of the door, the checking of the lock, I do think it's probably harder it's harder to detect and maybe even harder to validate in ourselves.
Absolutely. I agree 100%. And then as things start to get murkier as you get older and symptoms start to blend together or traits start to blend together, it then becomes even harder to pick it apart sometimes to get a good sense of what's really going on.
For sure. I mean, like ADHD kind of compulsive checking because of all of the errors we make.
Yep.
Like that can look a lot like OCD. I know because I do like rereading emails. I know part of it is my dyslexia and ADHD, and part of it's OCD. And I can actually feel the difference, but like it could look very similar. Or autistic ritualistic behavior and compulsions can look very similar.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
What was going on in your 20s that you were diagnosed with OCD?
There's a lot of obsessive thinking, for sure. A lot of obsessive worrying, a lot of what you would call like obsessive traits and tendencies, like thinking about things, rumination, constant worry and concern, and then the compulsive acts, right? The behaviors behind the obsessions. And I think a lot of it was tied to gambling addiction because there was so
Mhm.
much obsessive and ruminative process around gambling. There was so much compulsion around gambling. There were certain things I had to do ritualistically. So I think a
Mm.
lot of that felt in alignment. And that's where it gets really even trickier when we've had the addiction episode before. If we throw addiction into the mix, it really complicates mental health symptoms and exacerbates them even further to a point of like chicken or egg situation.
Yeah. Yeah. Absolutely. And this is something I've been thinking about partly as I've been doing more like reading into OCPD and OCD. Like I think of having an obsessive mind as almost like a meta concept that tracks with a lot of these. I don't I haven't yet met someone with OCD who doesn't also have an obsessive mind, but I think
Right.
someone can have an obsessive mind and not have OCD. I think most autistic people have an obsessive mind.
Yep.
And I have so many obsessive tendencies.
Yep.
And so I think that can get confusing too, because I think that's a construct beyond these diagnoses is how obsessive your mind is.
Yep.
Oh, I know what the inline thought was. I think obsessive minds, I think we're so vulnerable to addiction because we're just looking for something to turn off the obsessive mind. Um, and to get that moment of relief of my mind isn't spinning out.
Absolutely. Yeah. And, if we look at OCD a lot of times of like anxiety management or ways to mitigate trauma response, of course, we want that obsessive mind to slow down or just stop and give us a reprieve. That's always what I was
Mhm.
looking for is like, can I just have a reprieve from my own self, my own thoughts, my own mind? And it's the compulsion piece that is a struggle for me because if I'm obsessing about something and ruminating and it's just constantly on that loop, that compulsion to then take action is so
Mhm.
strong. And it could be at night, right? Like the obsessive thought of like, I need to go check something. I need to go check something. I need to write this
Mhm.
down. I need to write this down. And then compulsive act, which happens at 2, 3, 4 in the morning. And it feels like you don't even have power over the compulsion because it's so
Mhm.
strong. And that can be really frustrating.
And I think what you've just described there, that really is the heart of OCD, right? And compulsions don't always have to be present to be diagnosed with it because there's pure O. But typically, like the kind of more classic presentation is there's this tight relationship between obsessions and compulsions. And the obsession, just so our listeners, we can all be on the same page, that's like intrusive thoughts, images, or urges. And these are things that so the way that they're described clinically, they're ego dystonic, meaning their intention with kind of how we see ourselves and our core values. So if we value, for example, safety or not harming others, we might have an intrusive image of doing the exact opposite of that, of harming someone. So that's obsessions, and they're intrusive in that they kind of come yeah, they feel like intrusive, uninvited guests who have just barged in. And they create a lot of distress and anxiety. And then compulsions are something that function to neutralize the obsession and to kind of take down the anxiety. So, like for example, when I was a kid, one that I had, um, I would say goodbye to my parents in the exact same way when I'd leave for school. I'd say, "Bye, love you, don't die." And if I didn't say that exact thing, the anxiety was they were gonna die, and there was something about doing that compulsion that it felt like I was, like, sealing them with safety, and so the compulsion, what it does is it reduces the anxiety in the short term, but in the long term, it actually gives more power to the obsession, which is why OCD untreated tends to grow our life tends to get a lot smaller and the anxiety in the long term gets a lot bigger. But it's why those compulsions are so hard to sidestep, because it leaves us feeling like incomplete or just so much anxiety when we don't do the compulsion.
Yeah, that what you just described is such a good example of what this can feel like. Because even as a kid, when you were doing this, I imagine if you were not able to say that in that specific order, that could really throw your day for a loop where that's all you were thinking about for the rest of the day. That's all you were experiencing. Then all of a sudden, anxiety is going to start ramping up and intensifying. Then you're going to be distracted because the only thing you can
Mhm.
think about is my parents are going to die. I didn't say this in this specific order.
Exactly. And this is where OCD and ADHD can be like, it's a common pairing, and
Right.
it can be so painful because intrusions and those unwanted thought take up so much brain space. And I like, this isn't probably the most affirming way of describing ADHD, but the mental imagery that comes to mind is like a beehive with the holes coming out. And so like my thoughts are often like getting out when I don't want them to, and it's hard to hold things in mind. And then it's like being when you have OCD, it's like being attacked. Like there's a a I'm probably mixing metaphors, but maybe like a hornet has come into the nest and all of a sudden the hive is under attack. So all my resources are going to like defend the invader, and then any thoughts I'm supposed to be tracking are absolutely gone. Like the bees have left the hive. Again, I'm not sure if this metaphor is working, but it's what came into my mind. And I think that's why OCD ADHD makes such a painful combo, is the intrusions take up so much mind space, so much of our executive functioning, which is already strained because of the ADHD.
Right. And then for someone who's experiencing something like that exact experience, and I think that's actually a good visual because I mean, it makes a lot of sense where all of your attention would then need to focus on this one thing, right? So ultimately leaving you kind of exposed in a lot of ways, mentally, physically, etc., just being unable to focus or process or even support yourself in other situations. Just thinking about how this can impact you, like as a child, as a teenager, as a young adult, in the school settings, in the work settings, in social settings, and then your executive functioning really takes a hit and diminishes, and ultimately, like it can leave you really frustrated internally. There's a lot of internal like
Mhm.
shame processing when you're like, I cannot get out of this loop. Like I cannot break this thought, even if I recognize that this is a irrational experience.
Mhm. Yeah, I think that is absolutely part of the pain of OCD, is like again, that's that ego dystonic part, is there is often awareness this is irrational, or it's just it's so again alien to our experience. But like when I'm like here's a mind, I don't know that I like would meet full threshold for OCD or at this point. I probably Actually, I probably would. It's just so much of my compulsions are internalized. But like one that I'll often fall into. So I send out an email every Sunday, and it's at this point I'm sending it out to like 30,000 people, which is scary AF. And so I will like, even though I know, first of all, I logically know I have like no inappropriate files in my computer, but I will double check all the, not double check, I will like quadruple check all of the links. And I have this obsessive fear of like attaching something inappropriate to an email that goes out to 30 people, and I'll get sucked into a loop of triple, quadruple checking. I really probably need to hire someone to just hit the send button on those emails, because that'll be like a stuck point, a point where it's like my brain gets stuck and I'm like, I know this is irrational. I've literally checked this 5 times. Why am I still doing this?
Yeah. What ends up happening when you finally hit send after that? Does it break that loop? Or is there still
Um,
the obsessive, oh my God, I'm gonna get a response from someone saying, like, you sent this inappropriate thing.
so I think I feel relief when I hit send, because I've usually been kind of stuck in that cycle for a little bit.
Right.
I will then go to my email and see the final sent, because you can like send a test email, which I would have already done. I would have already tested, but I'll then go to my email and yet again check it all. But at that point, it's been sent, and so I'm kind of out of the loop. Um, again, because I'm very aware it's irrational. I'm very aware there's no like terrible link that I'm sending out.
That's a painful experience though, because just just something like that alone probably took a lot of mental energy and a lot of time. and being able to prevent that or circumnavigate that. Circumnavigate, is that a word? I don't know.
I like it, whether or not it's real or not. It's a good word.
Just like break away from that and focus energy elsewhere would probably be really relieving, but just the struggle to get out of that.
Yeah. Yeah. Absolutely. You know, and there's so many loops like that, and it's really interesting actually. For a while I used to say, well, I had OCD as a child. But then the more I've learned about OCD and the internalized OCD, I'm like, oh, that's actually a compulsion I do. Like, I actually get a lot of intrusive memories and images, especially memories of like awkward things I've done or times where I feel shame about how I've behaved. And I actually have quite a few internalized compulsions around that. And again, it's one of those things I was like, oh, I thought everyone did this. And, but yeah,
What
go
are
ahead.
some of the internalized compulsions that you have around some of that stuff?
Oh, okay.
If you're
This is
one.
where I get anxious. This is where I get anxious. Okay, I'm gonna share this, but I'm claiming full, like, we get to cut this if I decide I don't want this out.
Respect.
Um, so one compulsion that I have, and I like, I think that I would say I think this is an OCD. It feels like it follows the cycle. It's not as clean as some of my other OCD experiences. But one is if I have a memory of like something I said that I was like, that was awkward, or any kind of intrusive memory of, it could be recent, it could be later, like the thing I do right away. And it feels so fast, it feels unconscious. And I've met with a lot of neurodivergent people who do this and often feel shame about it. So maybe it is good for me to share. But I'll cuss myself out. I'll say something like, you stupid bitch. Or typically I'm using the F word directed at myself. And it's so fast. And at some point I realized that when I do that, it actually felt really similar to when I self-harmed in adolescence. And it's a way of, I am a bad person and I am punishing myself to kind of like equalize
Right.
that. And I also think it's a form of emotional avoidance. I'm like trying to swat away the discomfort that memory is bringing for me by like sharply cussing myself out. So this is something that pre-autism discovery, I was probably doing several hundred times a day. My autism discovery really did help reduce that a lot. I think, for one, I've just become much more gentle with myself in general. I also understand those memories and those, like, why they come and why I feel so much shame around awkward moments or moments I'm not proud of. And so now it probably still happens most days, but I'm much better at catching it and then kind of redirecting it or being gentle with myself. But it's still something that I experience. So that, yeah, that's not like a classic like obsessive compulsive, but the pattern of it feels familiar to me. It feels familiar to some of the obsessive compulsive patterns I've done throughout my life. Like in childhood, it looked different. So scrupulosity OCD, or like the fear of being a bad person, that can be one flavor, and that's certainly one that I have. So as a child growing up in fundamentalism, anytime I had a bad thought, and I was raised to believe God was in my mind, like judging all my thoughts. Every time I had a bad thought, I would invite Jesus into my heart again to be resaved. So, and I would do that like 100 times a day to like resave myself because I had sinned or had had a sinful thought. And that I can now see, like, that was an obsessive compulsive pattern for sure.
That's a painful
I don't
one.
know what's better, Patrick, like inviting Jesus into my heart or cussing myself out.
I don't know. Yeah, both have very different.
I mean, both are very shame based. Both are like, it's about like I guess the obsession there would all circulate around like being a bad person.
Yeah.
And both compulsions are trying to neutralize that.
And like you said before, right? In this, in this atypical sense, or this sense where people are having these thoughts and these intrusive experiences where it's like, I don't want to harm my baby. I don't want to harm my baby. And then you have a thought about harming your baby. Then there's almost this compulsive act, right? To release it.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Yeah.
You look like you have
No,
a
that actually, I'm glad you brought that up. So I had postpartum. Like when I look back at my life, I can see kind of spikes where OCD's been more prominent. And I had postpartum depression, anxiety, and then OCD as well. Just all the postpartum fun. So I did have intrusive images of hurting my children,
yeah.
which is, and this is actually, I wish there's more education around this. This is not uncommon, and it is so distressing when you experience it. And some moms will like put their baby down and not touch baby because they're so afraid they'll hurt them. That was actually one of my favorite like interventions when I was working in the perinatal, when I was working in an OB/GYN clinic, was to educate moms of like, if this thought is distressing to you, I'm not worried about you hurting your baby. Postpartum psychosis is when you're having those thoughts and that it's not distressing, and there's like, and it's in alignment with how you see, like how you see yourself. If you think you're going to be giving safety to your child by, I'm not going to go down that route. That's really, but
No,
yes, that
that's
is a
a good
very
point.
common OCD intrusion in the postpartum period, that can contribute to so much distress
Yeah. And
for people.
so glad you named that while you were working at this clinic, you were really an affirming source for these people, because so many people don't want to say that out loud, right? There's so much fear and shame. And if I say this to someone, what's going to happen? Like, are they going to call Child Protective
Mhm.
Service? If I have these intrusive thoughts about hurting myself at times, and but there's no compulsive need to act. Like, it's really hard for people to openly state these things to the public. So it's a great point. And I think when you're naming like these experiences that you've had where you've had to say these things to yourself, that kind of sounds in similar alignment to those intrusive experiences that people have as well.
Mhm. Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. And you're absolutely right. Like there's, postpartum psychosis moments, those get a lot of news coverage. And so I think there are a lot of parents where when they're having postpartum OCD, they don't have a reference point for that. Their reference point is the terrible stories they see on the news where someone has harmed their child. And so
Yeah.
you're absolutely right. There's so much fear about bringing these intrusive thoughts up, but I wish more would, because there's treatment and there's support for this, and then just learning like the fact that this thought scares you is a really good sign. Like even that in and of itself, and then there's a name for this, that these are intrusive thoughts.
Right.
Yeah,
And
yeah,
then it's not like a unique experience that the person's having, that they're not a bad person for
right,
having thoughts. Like,
yeah,
I think that's a big part of it, is like
absolutely,
affirming that you are not a bad person. You don't actually have the intention to act. Like, these thoughts are coming up, and that feels like a natural part of this process. And I think that's so
yeah,
important to as
yeah.
well.
One way I've heard it described that I really liked is it's your mind is over momming. Like you're thinking about the worst case thing possible,
Totally.
and your mind is over momming because it wants so badly to protect your child. So and I think that idea could be expanded to a lot of OCD. A lot of folks with OCD care a lot about safety, safety for self, safety to others, and it's like the brain is over safetying. It's like working so hard to ensure safety. Um, and in the process, gives us a lot of pain.
Yep. Absolutely. Absolutely. One thing when you're mentioning safety that's coming up for me is and I don't know if I would put this in the misconception bucket, but that like all OCD folks are like germaphobes and concerned about cleanliness at all times. I think that happens a lot in the media, where you start to see like hand washing, hand sanitizing, unable to use certain like facilities, being really cautious about certain things. And I think that's very true for a lot of people, but it's certainly not the case for a lot of people as
Mhm.
well.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, there's again, there's a lot of different subtypes of OCD, and that's part of why it can be tricky to diagnose. And so that would be contamination OCD. And that actually one of my children has had contamination OCD, and still has it to some degree. It can be incredibly debilitating, but it's just one of several different
Yeah.
kinds. And so, yeah, like symmetry OCD is another one. I had that as a child. So I would be like sitting down at a table, and if I touched it with one hand, it just didn't feel even. So then I'd have to touch it with the other hand, and then I'd get pulled into a loop where I'm like, I'm just like doing this with my hands where I'm frantically touching it until it feels just right, till it feels
Right.
even.
Yep.
It wasn't even logical. It wasn't like it actually was even. It was a sensation of like, this feels even.
Yep.
Or like I would do the same thing with my nose. I would twitch it to the side and then I'd have to twitch it to the other side. And then I'd be like twitching my nose in a loop until it was even, till it was just right.
I do that a
Um,
lot with like how I arrange things, and everything has to be like very specifically ordered and structured and symmetrical. Um, Tablecloths on a table, if it's a little uneven, I have this. Okay, thinking about this right now because I'm looking at my Shih Tzu sleeping. I have this blanket on the couch because he scratches the couch, but I tuck it into the couch and he scratched it, or someone sat on it and now it's uneven. I will be sitting there working, but I will be obsessing about the fact that it is uneven, and I will literally have to break what I'm doing to get up and like pull it and even it out. And in my mind, I'm saying, why is this? Why does this have such a hold over me? And like, it's just going to become uneven again. Like, he's inevitably going to scratch it. Someone's going to sit up, like, whatever. But it has so much power over me, and that compulsive need to act and
mhm.
break up whatever I'm doing, whatever I'm talking about. I can even get distracted in conversations and be like, and my wife will look at me and be like, "Are you staring at the picture on our wall that is a little bit uneven right now while we're talking about something important?" And I'm like, "Yes." She's like, "Do you need to go straighten it out?" I'll say, "Yes."
Yeah, so that would be like symmetry and order OCD. And this is the one I think is so tricky to tease apart from autism, because with autism, there can be some kind of precision
Yep.
preferences.
Yep, for sure. I had a professor in
I
grad
re-
school
Mhm.
who was like big into CBT. He taught a lot of our courses, unfortunately, but they're talking about like ERP, exposure,
Exposure response therapy.
yeah, prevention or whatever, and
Or
taking
yeah,
people to public toilets who had like what do you say, sanitation OCD?
contamination. Yeah.
OCD. My brain is scrambled. And he would have them like lick toilet seats and things like
Yeah.
that. Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah,
So
eh,
with exposure response, like you have to kind of overshoot the exposure. That's
yeah,
that's part of it.
right.
Um, yes. Yes. I've heard similar stories.
Yep. And you're like, yeah, we're just gonna lick this toilet seat together. I was like,
Mhm.
geez, this is fascinating.
Uh-huh.
I'm really happy that I don't ever have to experience this. Like,
Yes. I've also heard of like eating food off toilet seats
yep,
as a exposure. And yeah, I know we're gonna have some folks on who do like so there's a new treatment I've been hearing more about lately, inference based CBT,
yep,
which sounds like a more gentle approach, sounds like in general a more neurodivergent affirming approach. I do think ERP can be neurodivergent affirming when adapted.
yep,
Um, but I'm excited to hear from clinicians who are adapting these things to be more autistic friendly.
for sure.
But yeah, exposure work is hard. It's really hard, and it's basically, yeah, you're kind of taking back your territory of saying like, I actually am, instead of the fear controlling you, it's like, no, like I'm showing up and I'm beating you. I'm beating
Yep.
this anxiety. But you have to overshoot the exposure or like the fear. So if your fear is toilets, you like go beyond, which is it's intense. ERP is really hard. It's hard. It's a hard treatment.
I always view ERP, and I know we're gonna have like an ERP specialist on in this series, and I would love to pick their brain on this. But like, I've always viewed ERP as like, you've gotten to this place of like last resort. Like,
Hmm.
I'm so ready for this to no longer control how I move through the world, and it's been so freaking painful that I'm willing to put myself in a
Hmm.
situation where I am going to have to overshoot whatever the
Yeah.
fear is to be able to take some control back.
Yeah. I think that's so well said. Like the treatment is painful. The treatment is hard. So at the point where someone's doing that, OCD is painful and hard, and
Yeah,
treatment is like the lesser of the two pains. And this is where I do get annoyed. Like so OCD, faces a lot of microaggressions in the sense of people will be like, "Oh, I'm so OCD." If they're like they like having an organized desk, it's like,
Yeah.
or, or they like having clean hands. It's like, no, that's not OCD. Like
Right.
OCD is like I think my experience of it is it can be incredibly debilitating,
Yep.
and it makes our world very small. Which is also, I'm curious your thoughts. Like I do see some people embracing OCD as like a neurotype. I don't relate to my OCD that way. I do understand that there's like neural circuitry involved and there's a lot of genetics involved, especially if you had OCD before puberty. Um, then it's like there's a stronger genetic basis for it. But like, I don't own it as part of my neurotype. I do own like having an obsessive mind,
Yeah.
but I do know that, and I'm not, at the core of neurodivergent affirming practice is self-determination. So if people want to like identify that way, I'm not like, that's for them. It's just not personally, I don't incorporate it as a part of my identity that I'm proud of. I see this as a mental health condition that I live with and that I treat and that I am trying to have less power over my life.
Yeah, I agree 100%. I don't look at it as my own as a neurotype. Again, self-determination. However you want to identify or however you want to connect to any of your neurodivergent experiences is totally okay. I don't look at it as something that feels all encompassing though. Like I don't think of it as like this impacts my behavior, my social needs, like my sensory. Like I just don't look at it as that all encompassing viewpoint. Um, I guess I guess when I think about like all of this stuff that we've experienced, and you and I have very similar experiences in a lot of ways, is like autism and ADHD kind of really drive the ship. They're
Hmm.
really front and center. They really take up a lot of energy and just processes and traits and experiences. And I always think about it that way.
Yeah.
Um, but hell, 3 years ago, I didn't think about either of them as that way. So
Yeah.
I don't
Yeah.
know. You
Yeah.
know, it's something to explore. But I like what you said about like not everyone is OCD just because you like a clean desk or you like clean hands.
Mhm.
And that feels very much like folks who have social anxiety who are like, I'm a little autistic, right? Like there's a little bit, but then it's like, let's zoom out. What is the reasoning for your action? Like, what is it doing
Mhm.
for you to be able to have a clean desk or clean hands? Like, what is happening for you when you're socially anxious versus like being autistic and being overwhelmed sensory wise all the time? So, I think it is about looking at it from that zoomed out lens too, to say like, what is the meaning behind your action or your process?
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah. Yeah. Mhm.
Trying to think of other OCD tendencies and traits. I experience a lot of my stuff at night, and a lot of it is obsessing about sleep and lack of sleep, and just the struggle in that experience, that rumination that comes over, the intrusive thoughts that come over, can lead to compulsion for sure. Um, and that's something I've experienced my entire life. I remember like intrusive, like really bad nightmares and experiences as a kid. And even like to the point of almost like auditory hallucination, when I was like
Mm.
7, 8, 9 years old, where I would hear like a voice over and over and over again that would say like hello, and it would get louder and louder and louder to the point of I would have to get up and then have a compulsive act to break that loop. And I would have to almost say out loud, like you were saying about your own experience before, like, this is not real. Like, this is not
Mhm.
happening. I would have to name it and say it and like go through a ritualistic experience to shut it off. I actually ended
Mm.
up going to the doctor at like 8 years old because my dad was like, I think my child is psychotic. Like, I think there's something
Mm.
happening at night that is creating like this psychotic process.
That is so interesting. So we should maybe do a whole episode on this once, but there's been some interesting research about abnormal perceptions in autism, and it's more common for us to have abnormal perceptions. So like to hear things,
Yeah.
especially, and it has to do with kind of how our neurons work. But me too. I actually just realized um, a couple years ago that this was an abnormal perception, but sometimes I'll hear music. It probably only happens when I'm really tired, and it probably only happens maybe once a year. And for a long time, I was like, the narrative I had was and I realized that this sounds psychotic. My narrative was like, I think my brain is able to pick up radio wavelengths and I'm hearing a radio in my brain.
Yeah.
And I was like, it was when I was doing the research on abnormal perceptions that I was like, oh, I wasn't actually hearing the radio. Like that was a hallucination of some kind.
Yeah. Yeah. I think it's fascinating. And it's unfortunate because, all of these experiences that feel so, I don't know, this is not going to sound affirming, like strange or bizarre or irrational when we're experiencing them ourselves. There's so much like shame and
Mhm.
vulnerability and just telling people this stuff, like it took so much as a child to go into my dad's room and be like, so I can't sleep because I'm hearing this voice amplifying and getting louder every single night. And it's like ringing in my freaking ears. I cannot go to sleep. And, I think it's just one of those things that we tend to suppress a lot of the time too. We just don't
Yeah.
want to talk about any of this stuff publicly.
And I actually, that would be an interesting kind of survey to do. Like, I wonder how many, and I think especially autistic, maybe ADHD too, like people have had a fear of, and I mean, I don't usually use the word crazy because it's
Yeah.
it's like a kind of a slur of mental health. But in this context, I'm going to use it in quotes, like fear of being crazy, quote unquote.
Yep.
I know I've at times in my life experienced that, especially when I had PTSD, because all my sensory stuff, everything was incredibly bizarre.
Yep.
But I think the between like OCD and just having we in general having more intrusive thoughts and images, and then abnormal perceptions, I actually think it's a pretty common experience to fear like that we are crazy or going crazy.
Yep.
And I mean that in the psychosis, but I think the narrative we often say,
Yeah.
narrative I've said is like, am I crazy?
Yeah.
And I think learning some of this stuff, like sometimes it is a sign of psychosis, and we should, if we're having experiences consistent with psychosis, we should check that out. But sometimes it's like intrusive thoughts or it's abnormal perceptions, and it's not actually psychosis, but it's like our neurons misfiring and being weird.
Yeah. Yeah. And when you don't have any of this information or the resources or the language to put to it, it's really confusing and it's really overwhelming. And it does make you have those internalized thoughts of like, quote unquote, again, for those of you not watching this, like I'm going crazy. How am I supposed to talk about this? Who am I supposed to talk about this with? Who's going to get it? How am I going to be judged for even bringing this up to someone? I think there's still so much work to be done, and that's a different episode. But yeah, and it's just like the stigma of mental health that still exists in 2024. So it's just
Yeah. It's huge, especially around psychosis. There's so much stigma around psychosis, particularly. Yeah. And I'd also throw in paranoid thinking. That's another one that, because of this like social isolation and victimization paired with rumination, autistic people can actually have a lot of paranoid thinking.
Yep.
And that can look like psychosis, or it could look like one of the kind of schizoaffective spectrum conditions. Yeah. Oh, okay. I'm leaping here a little bit, and I think I know Brittany's going to talk about inference-based CBT when she comes on, but I'm hearing this more from inference-based CBT folks. This idea that part of what predisposes us to OCD is not being able to trust our own perceptions, because what's happening with OCD is we're often making inferences based on our imagination more than our senses. And I find that a really interesting take on OCD. And I do think, like, in general, both autistic and ADHD people, we struggle to trust ourselves, to trust our perceptions, to trust our narratives, because what we're reporting and the feedback we're getting from our environment are often mismatched. We often experience a lot of traumatic invalidation around our sensory experiences. So I think this idea of self-trust, fear of like, do I have a good grip on reality? I think this is intimately connected to OCD, because it's essentially we're second guessing our grip on reality. Like when I triple check the locks or I triple check the stove, I know I have checked it, but there's some inference there that tells me it's still on. Like there's this faulty belief, and I can't trust my perception of having just checked the lock.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. And I think when you throw in ADHD or something else into the mix and you're struggling with your focus and maybe getting distracted, then you really can't trust yourself sometimes to say, like, did I actually check this thing? I do this thing in the shower where I have to say out loud, you're putting shampoo in your hair, right?
Oh yeah, I do that too.
Yeah. And I will put it in my hair and then I'll wash it out and then I'll think to myself,
Did I shampoo?
Yeah. I can't tell you how many days I have, like, days where I probably shampoo 3 times. I'm like, this is ridiculous. And I'll be in the shower, like, thinking this to myself, like, over and over and
Yep.
obsessing about it too.
Yep. Yep.
Yeah. I have another one where I lose the remote in our bed all the time. And I will say to myself, I am putting the remote here to the right of my head. I will say it out loud. Literally 2 minutes later, where's the fucking remote? Shaking my sheets in my bed. And like, I poor wife, she's just always looking at me like, what is it like to be you? It's,
Yeah.
it's
I feel like at the heart of a lot of these experiences, and I've started talking about this more, is a loss of self-trust. With ADHD, it's I don't trust my mind. Like I don't trust my mind to remember this, so I have to do it right now. With autism, I think there's a lot of lack of trust in our sensory perceptions because they do tend to be abnormal compared to like the normative. With OCD, there is I don't trust the inferences I'm making. I don't trust that I'm good. I don't trust and that lack of self-trust, I think is some of the most painful aspects of all of these conditions because it's really hard to move through the world with agency when we don't trust ourselves, when we don't trust our minds, when we don't trust our perceptions, when we don't trust the stories we're telling ourselves.
damn. You so often say these things that are very profound where I'm like, ugh. Yeah. Yeah, that's 100% right. It's a complicated and challenging and overwhelming existence for sure. And a painful one in a lot of ways.
Yeah. And I don't know, maybe I'm working to move away from the discomfort of this emotion, but I do think when we know that, I think there's ways we can build self-trust. And
For sure.
I think that's the power of like we talk a bit about late in life discovery. I think that's the power of it. I think since discovering my autism, my ADHD, I've been in the process of rebuilding self-trust. And with that has come agency. And with that has come a lot of healing. I'm still in process. But having the accurate narrative to understand my experiences, that is what kickstarted the process of building self-trust. And that's why I continue and want to continue to advocate for late in life diagnosis or identification, because I think that is so essential in that rebuilding of self-trust.
I agree 100%. I think we're going to derail now.
As we do.
As we do. As we tend to do. So that was our OCD episode. Yeah, rebuilding that self-trust is so huge. And I think it's really like, I'm trying to find the words, maybe like beautiful to watch people discover it for themselves because I just think so often we go back to that, like searching for the meaning, the like confusion around experience. And there can always be that grief of, I wish I would have found it sooner, right? Like I was having that grief yesterday about some chronic health stuff. I'm like, fuck, if my parents just like paid attention to me, understood that getting strep 5 times a year is not normal, like stuff like that. But in reality, discovery later in life has really helped me just put words to things, just put meaning and understanding to experiences, to start trusting my overwhelm, to start trusting my body. Sometimes it just feels weird to say because I so often can't connect to it, to trust my needs and set better boundaries. I don't know. It's just been for me, it's been really life-changing, and it has not necessarily made life unbelievably easy to navigate, but it certainly has allowed me to start to build some of that and start to build some of that like self-love too. Have
Yeah.
a little more compassion for myself. Um, had a friend who was recently on this podcast message me the other day and say like, I am just really beating the shit out of myself for
Mm.
all of my ADHD symptoms and like not being able to do these things and track these things and navigate these things. I was like, we've got to be gentle with ourselves. Like, if ADHD and autism are disabling conditions, like we have to be gentle with
Mhm.
ourselves and acknowledging like there are just certain things that we are really going to struggle with and
Yeah.
potentially not be able to do. And I know that it can be hard to relinquish that like that control of it sometimes, but like that for me has been really helpful as well to just be like, I've got to be easy on myself in this situation instead of like beating the hell out of myself.
Absolutely. I love how you said that. Like, I started to put words to it, and just yeah, the power of naming things, especially with what we've just talked about. Of like, we do tend to have a lot of abnormal experiences, perceptions,
Yep.
both within our bodies and minds, but also relationally.
Yep.
And the power of naming, like this has a name. This is autism or ADHD or OCD, and that is it unlocks so much, and I see that too, and I love witnessing that, like, when it unlocks gentleness, and
Yep.
I was not at all able to be gentle with myself until I had these lenses to understand myself. I was and I understand it, I kind of actually see it. I was just talking about this the other day, like, I think this is why it's so hard to release the inner critic, is the inner critic is playing a protective role when you're an undiagnosed autistic ADHD OCD human. It's protecting you from other people's criticism. And
Yep.
so it's really hard to release that because yes, it's harming you, but it's also protecting you from the shame of other people.
Yeah.
And so until you understand that it's because you're neurodivergent and you're having these experiences, it's really hard to release that inner critic.
Yep. There's an IFS book called No Bad Parts. That
I like that book. Yeah.
Yeah, because it's kind of that that concept of like, yeah, this inner critic is really painful. It can be really harmful. It can also really protect us from the world around us.
Mhm.
I think when we're talking about putting words to experiences and saying this stuff out loud or just saying it to yourself or sharing it with friends and having other people say, oh, that feels really like relatable to me. Um, and I think it allows you to kind of reduce some of that harsh criticism that comes with like this constant feeling of, I don't really understand why I don't fit into the world around me.
Mhm.
I mean, you still live in an ableist society, so it doesn't solve all the problems, but it certainly gives you perspective.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think that's a helpful, like, for those of us who can fall into all or nothing thinking, like, yeah, it's not some magical solving all the problems, but it leads to that self understanding, which can lead to self trust, which can make it a lot easier to move through the world in a way that we're gentle with ourselves. But it certainly doesn't. Like, I'd love to have a before and after diagnosis story that's super clean. Like,
Yeah.
I, before diagnosis, was doing this, and then I was diagnosed, identified, and like all of the like, and I do have some of that, like before after narrative, but it's messy. It's not like I'm magically stopped struggling with depression or anxiety or OCD or
Chronic
like
health or anything.
or
Yeah.
cussing myself out during the day. Like, yeah,
But maybe it's
yeah.
like gotten like this much.
Yeah, no, it's gotten a lot better. It's gotten a lot better, and I understand myself so much better, and my family dynamics are so much better, and like there have been huge improvements, but it's not like a magic
It's
pill.
not a it's not a cure all for sure. Um,
Which, speaking of, can we hop back into OCD for a minute?
for sure.
I think one thing I do want to like make sure is clear. So we don't talk about treating autism or ADHD. We do talk about supporting it. But with OCD, it is very treatable. I mean, there is that genetic component. So I don't remember the exact citation, but I think it's about 50% of of people with OCD will kind of continue to have it throughout their life. It'll ebb and flow. But this responds really well to there's pharmaceutical medication for OCD. There's treatments, which we're going to dive into in the series, both ERP and inference-based CBT, and there's other treatments. And so OCD is very treatable in the sense of, especially if it's at the point where it's your life is very small because the obsessions have so much power. I just want people to know, like, this is a condition that has treatments that have that work.
Well said. Super important point. So that we can, there is optimism out there. There is hope out there. There can definitely be treatment and change and difference. I think going back to do I consider OCD a neurotype? That's probably a reason that I don't necessarily identify in that regard, because if it is treatable, can I ever relinquish my autism, ADHD neurotype? No. And
Right.
I think that's something I think about too. But I really appreciate that you just named that, because I know we can become sometimes doom and gloom, which I don't think this episode has been. I think it's been a mixture of both, which I like to have those episodes.
I like those too. I think they're very humanizing, and we've shared a lot of personal.
Yeah. Oh yeah.
Oh, if this is the only episode someone ever listened to, they'd have an interesting take on us.
I'm super proud of you, and I know that's uncomfortable, but if we look back at episode 1 till now, which is going to be episode 72 or 3, which is crazy. It's one thing you wanted was to be more vulnerable and to share more of yourself, and I think you've done a really fantastic job, and I know it's not always comfortable, if ever comfortable. So you don't have to take it in, and you don't have to receive it. Anyway, I want to share a story real quick, or you go first before I share the story.
No, go for it.
You were mentioning looping. If we just tracked visually where these conversations go. So looping back to post-discovery, understanding self better, not having this magic fix erasure situation where everything's clean and everything falls into place. So my dad messaged me yesterday. He kind of has come to terms with his autism diagnosis. He'll never say that out loud, but from interactions. And we invited him to go to Thanksgiving with my wife's family, and she sent him a picture because he asked how many people will be there. I did not want to look at this picture, and I wish I hadn't, but there's 55 people who are going to be there. They're all standing outside of this place together as a family, from years ago. And I'm and she's oh, that's not even counting so-and-so, so-and-so, so-and-so. And I'm holy shit. Okay. I have to really mentally prepare for this to participate, because I know she's asked me for almost 10 years to do this. I'm going to do it this year. But my dad messaged us and he was I don't think my body and my brain can handle that experience. So I don't think I can come to that. And I was really proud of him for at 66 years old, just acknowledging and naming that. So
I love that. That is really powerful. Yeah. And that's speaking about putting words to things. Often when we start putting words to things, there's a ripple effect. Our family members, also one of my parents has slowly come around to identifying as autistic, and I think it's been a helpful lens for that parent. Yeah, the ripple effect.
yeah.
And I love in my newsletter, I've probably gotten a dozen or 24 from 60 to 88-year-olds who are just discovering this.
Yep.
And I often say, when I discovered this at 37, there's so much to unpack. I
Yep.
can't imagine being in my 70s or 80s and looking back at all that life lived without the accurate lens. And I just when folks in their 60s to 80s are willing to reconsider their whole life.
Yeah.
I would love, someone just asked, they were do you have resources for a 70-year-old? And I was oh, I wish I did, because I want that generation to be able to connect. I feel really connected to our generation of lost autistic adults, but I'd love, so if any listeners know of resources for.
Yeah, send them in. I also really love that. I think I've mentioned that to you, and this is actually the prologue of the book that I'm writing, but I talk about this 70-year-old woman who came up to me during my keynote in Alaska and was that was the first time I've ever felt understood in my entire life. Do you think it's worth going and pursuing a diagnosis? And I was if you're asking me that question, then I think the answer is absolutely yes. And I hope that it brings you some comfort or relief and
Mm.
understanding or just being seen. I think that's so
Yeah.
powerful. Just being seen and understood and affirmed, and especially like at 70 years old, right? Like going through an entire life of confusion and not being able to identify or put words to some of this stuff, and always like questioning why or beating yourself up for. That's a tender spot for me too.
Mhm. Yeah. Yeah. We always somehow bring it back to autism. Autism's our home base. See, so if it was a house, I would say like autism feels like my foundation, and like
Yeah.
ADHD is kind of the walls, and then OCD is like an uninvited guest that and barges in at like some seasons of my life more so than others.
Yeah. And then I would like sprinkle in like the fixtures and the furniture and the carpet or the flooring would be like constant chronic depression. And maybe some
Why am I laughing at that? That's the like I'm just like, yep, yeah, our houses are kind of pathetic. But yeah, anxiety and depression are in my I
Yeah.
actually kind of want to actually design this. Like, what do our neurological houses look like?
I would love
Although I like to think of depression and anxiety as guests too, because I like to kick them out of my house,
Sure.
whereas autism and ADHD feel baked into my house.
That's fair. Yeah. That's a wonderful visual, I think. If
I think,
put-
you know what? Depression is actually like, it's an old man sitting on a rocker on my porch.
shaking his fist at like people who get too close or make too much
Yeah.
noise. Yeah.
And it's just kind of like always lingering there, but like sometimes I can kind of forget he's there.
Right. Sometimes you can go outside, walk past him, pay him no mind, get in your car and drive to wherever. Yeah.
Yeah.
We should create. You're so good at creating these visuals. Like you should create a graphic about that, because it would certainly go viral and be very relatable. So,
Or I'd get so much hate though. Like, this is not how that's depicted.
oh yeah, my house actually has blinds made of anxiety and whatever.
Yeah.
I-
No, but
I-
I would like to do that for my own. I want to make a mock-up of my neurological house.
Yeah. Would not sell on Zillow, but it would be
0-star review. I do not recommend my neurological house. If I was
Oh.
selling it.
this was good today. So I feel like we're at our natural conclusions.
Yes.
We
Yes.
just talked for a long time. It's 1:47.
Well, my internet was part of the long talk. My internet didn't like that we were talking about OCD today. It was protesting.
Well, so this may be split into 2 episodes. It may not. I don't know. We just talked for an hour and a half. For everyone listening, we're excited to embark upon this series for OCD from a neurodivergent affirming lens. We have some great guests coming on. We have new episodes out on Fridays on all major platforms and YouTube. You can like, download, subscribe, and share. And goodbye.